Welcome everyone to IHR series. Will be interviews with important authors of books about different aspects of criminal justice here in America. And leading off is Professor Laurence from Princeton University. As I mentioned, Kim Haven will be joining me in this interview. We'll be sharing questions of Professor Rao. We plan to question Professor Rao for no more than 40 minutes. And then we'll open up for Q&A. And if everyone can look at the bottom of their screen, there is a Q&A function. So as you go, you can enter questions there, and I'll be looking at them a little later and choosing them, as a follow-up to Professor Rao. The interview is being recorded, and we plan to then post the full interview on our website and a few other and links on different social media. So that just so everyone knows what our plans are about that. So welcome, Professor Ralph. I would like to start by, if you could just give a summary, if you can, of who John Berg is, why he's an important figure in your book, what the kind of torture he employed he used. Those are, I guess we could start off with that.
Great. Thank you, Charles, for this invitation, and thanks for having me. And thanks for engaging in important issues around criminal justice and taking it upon yourself to educate your community. John Burge. John Burge is a difficult figure to talk about because he engineered a torture ring in Chicago that we know began in the 70s, but it went through the 80s and the 90s. And after that time, there was a lot of activism to hold John Burge accountable for the torture he inflicted. What we know in the most conservative estimates is that he tortured or was responsible for overseeing the torture of at least 125 Black men in Chicago. And those men are connected to each other through the torture techniques that he and others used, and their ability to kind of prove through the marks on their body, through the evidence that they marshaled, that they had been tortured in this way. The most kind of famous device that's associated with the torture of these suspects is called the black box. And originally, we think it was a military-grade field telephone that was kind of repurposed for shocking people and electrocuting them with the crank of a handle. I mention that because that device is largely responsible for our ability to claim that these men were tortured. When we think about torture, it's actually a very fraught term, and we talk a lot about police violence. We talk a lot about police brutality in the abstract. But when we're referring to torture, we're referring to almost a kind of international set of violations of human rights and state-sanctioned violence that these men were connected to through the particular instruments that John Burge and the police officers he commanded used on their bodies. And so for those reasons, John Burge is a very important figure in this story. Again, he connects what's taking place in Chicago to the kinds of torture that are taking place throughout the globe. And he also represents the inability to hold law enforcement officials accountable for the violence they do enact.
What was his position in the Chicago police? How did that work?
Well, he kind of rose through the ranks. So when he originally, the first person that he was accused of torturing in 1982 was a man named Andrew Wilson. And then John Burge was a detective in the Chicago police force. But by the time that um, the, 50 and 100 uh, people were being tortured, he eventually rose to the ranks of commander of Area 2 precinct. And so by that time, he was kind of in charge of his own team that was extracting confessions from criminal suspects. And that's where a lot of the torture took place. So why is this important? It's important because his rank and his ability to rise through the ranks shows that torture is connected to other kinds of law enforcement practices, such as extracting confessions. And once people are seen as being good at that, once they're seen as reliable, they're actually rewarded for those things. And then it becomes harder to uncover the truth of the violence they inflict.
But
You you stated in your book that the knowledge of what was going on was both extensive. It was open, but it was also secret. So how does an open secret somehow stay secret?
that alone isn't a.
Yeah, that was one of the key questions of the book that I tried to grapple with. And so, uh, an open secret is a little different from a secret. I think we're all familiar with the secret in the idea that if you tell something to somebody, they should not tell anyone. And we can see how, when it comes to a scandal, uh, that idea of keeping things very quiet can perpetuate the scandal. But an open secret is a little bit different. An open secret is the idea that even if people know about it, it doesn't matter because nothing will happen.
So as
And
a follow-up, sort of like what we're finding in contemporary law enforcement now, we know that things are happening, but nobody is doing anything about it.
yeah, exactly. And so we know, I think as a country, we're well aware of the fact that even if a police officer shoots someone, it will be extremely hard and kills them. It will be extremely hard for them to even get uh, arrested or indicted, right? And uh, and we know that part of that is because of the law itself. Part of that's because police officers are always given the benefit of the doubt. But there's within communities that are the subject of police violence, there is just a lack of trust and lack of legitimacy within the police themselves. So they don't even believe that the law is a necessary is a recourse for them to achieve justice. And so when I was originally conducting research in Chicago, um, this was even before the Black Lives Matter movement, and there were incidents where young men who were running away from the police were shot in the back and died. And so community members were saying, we know nothing's going to happen to these police officers because nothing's happened to John Burge. So there was a knowledge that Burge had tortured these people, but there was also a knowledge that even though he tortured them, nothing would happen.
Tell me, another important figure in your book is a man named Andrew Wilson. If you could tell me what he did and what his significance is to the whole story that you bring to light in your book.
Yeah, I chose Andrew Wilson to talk about for a particular reason, uh, in that he is an unsympathetic figure. Well, he's important because he's the first person to expose police torture and the first person to bring a civil suit against the city of Chicago and John Burge and claim that he had been tortured. And he did so while he was on trial and accused of killing 2 police officers. And there was a lot of evidence that he did do this crime. And so the jury in his cases didn't want to hear any evidence of torture. They didn't want to hear the claim that he had been tortured. And in fact, even though there was evidence that he had been, beaten, suffocated, electrocuted in police custody, the jury saw this as a reaction to the crimes he was accused of. And so this case is very important to me to think with and think through, because I think on the one hand, there are people who have been tortured who are clearly innocent. And it's easy for us to see the horrific nature of torture when we look at an innocent person and say, well, look, this is a clear sense of injustice. This person is innocent, and they were still, tortured. But what about the person that we don't know if they're innocent or not? Do they still deserve to be tortured? And I think this is a really important test that I want to challenge the readers. I want to challenge everyone in our democracy to really think through, because what ends up happening is that the jury in Andrew Wilson's case said, well, in this case, we'll allow the torture of this man because he was accused of doing something really horrific. But by allowing that, they also allowed John Burge to remain on the police force, and they also allowed a torture ring to last for decades. And so hundreds of more people were tortured after Andrew Wilson because of the way that he was denigrated during that trial, at least in part. And so I think we really have to think through the way that we think about torture in the law, but also in our popular conscience, in our popular culture. Since writing this book, and even while writing this book, I saw so many, TV shows where people were tortured in police custody, and people were tasered, and it was even seen as comic relief. All right, there's a way that torture becomes normalized in our culture, and we really have to think about what is that doing to our democracy. What is that doing to the rule of law when we allow torture to take place?
I really appreciate that point. Interfaith action.
Can I just interrupt for one quick second? The idea that all of these systems actors and even the community were all complicit in the torture that not only occurred, because obviously it was well known, and your book kind of lays out, that it was extensively known. But for the jury to come back and to basically sign off on the torture, for it to continue, the fact that it continued so long and people knew about it. I mean, even now, you just talked about, we see on police body cams and, cell phones, and, we're all complicit in this. And I think that in your book was probably one of the hardest things for me to reconcile, is just this level of so many people were aware of what was happening and yet either did nothing, attempted to do something, and suffered repercussions for that. But now it's become, as you said, normalized. We kind of accept it wholesale, which makes us, again, complicit in what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think this is when I started to think through just the idea of the open secret, how something can just be hidden in plain sight, and this idea of complicity, it really forces you to think about what we allow to happen on an everyday basis. And I think um, it's not just about police violence. It's also about things like sexual harassment and the Me Too movement. And you can just see how powerful people are being protected because no one wants to risk, you know, being on the wrong side of that person's power. And the people who do risk it, you see what happens to them, right? And so this is, I think, a way of seeing structural issues when it comes to bad actors, but also how they're protected within a system because of uh, either people are directly benefiting from them or people are learning to not get any knowledge because that will also put them in danger. And so in the book, I think of this as, you know, learning to know what not to know. You know, there's a group of police officers who were against Burge, but they learned to know how to keep quiet. They learned to know, you know, when to leave the precinct. They learned to know when to take time off so they could avoid knowledge that would then force them to deal with the contradiction of their own complicity.
Use, I was going to say before that the point you make about torture and that even uh, even if people have done terrible crimes, they still need to be respected. Um, is is a principle that our organization was founded on. This idea that every human being is created in an image of God and deserves respect, no matter what he or she may have done. So I really, that point that you make and elucidate so well in the book, and highlight it then with the whole controversy over Burge is really important. Um, you use the metaphor of a tree in the book to describe torture. What was, maybe you could just talk a little bit about that, why that was powerful for you as a way to describe torture.
Yeah. So, you know, I was at first it came because I was thinking through this idea of bad apples and how, um, you know, we tend to individualize people who we see as bad actors, and we say, you know, there's something especially sadistic about this person. There's something especially evil about this person, but we don't often think of like how that person is nurtured, how they're developed, how they grow, how they, you know, get into the position where they are able to enact torture. And so I think the torture tree metaphor was a way for me to get at this idea of open secret, the idea that torture could be hidden in plain sight, like a tree in a forest, and also it was a way for me to talk about, you know, how people rise through the ranks and become complicit and also protectors and enablers of torture. Because, you know, the district attorney who hears that someone is tortured and doesn't say anything, then they eventually become a judge. And when they're a judge, they don't hear any cases on torture. Or the police officer who worked in Burge's precinct, even if he doesn't necessarily like Burge or is on Burge's side, he may eventually become a politician. And while he's a politician, he tries to kind of ignore the debate about torture from the public. And so I am tracking certain people who, you know, rose through the ranks within these decades and became powerful people within the criminal justice system of Chicago. And as a part of their power, they shielded Burge from torture allegations because they were in some way, directly or indirectly, complicit. So at the end, when you sketch out all these lines of connection, it's like sketching out a family tree. It's like sketching out a genealogy. And so for me, the torture tree became a kind of way to talk about how those branches and connections develop over time.
You know, it's a very powerful image that you lay out, and it's actually something that, you know, in reading this book, I have kind of figured out how I can, in some of the work that I do, it becomes a very graphic visualization of just how intrinsically people are involved in this process. And again, we go back to the issue of being complicit in things, but the roles that people play to shield. You know, there's that code of blue. You said in your book that it must be hard to be an honest cop working under a dishonest commander or supervisor. And so we have that playing out, and it has never gone away, because as you said, people, you know, they may start out and, you know, they rise through the ranks, and it perpetuates that wall, that shield of not holding people accountable. But I think the interesting thing for me too is that if you look at contemporary policing, just for a real quick flash forward, the idea that some of the officers that are committing what we're seeing playing out on the streets right now are torturing the very community members to where they live. And yet there's still that wall of protection. And I think that to have it posted as a tree and to just kind of see almost those tentacles rather than tree branches is something that is powerful, and I'm going to use it in my work. But you also talked about the black box as a metaphor, and you told us a little bit about what the black box was. How did that become a metaphor for you?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the black box, it's about, you know, on the one hand, just a literal torture device, and how just the kind of visceral nature of how torture is inflicted, and you know, there's a kind of connection there too, where you know, the black box was basically an electrocution device where, you know, you connect a clamp to someone, and you know, you crank the handle, and you know, electricity goes into their body. So there's a way in which that the horror of that pain is so visceral, and it's hard to describe, and it's hard to even think about, but it produces a kind of knowledge that's important, you know, because the marks left on the body allowed Andrew Wilson to make the claim that, no, this horrific thing happened to me. I'm not making it up. And so even when we could find no evidence of the device itself, people could recreate the device based on the description of the marks on his body. And I think that's important, because that allowed a community of torture survivors to eventually become visible to each other. And so, you know, especially within the court of law, it serves as that kind of evidence that over time becomes irrefutable. And so, you know, the black box for me was like a way of thinking through all those things where we say, you know, there's not enough evidence, we can't prove it, we don't know enough, it's their word against the police officer's word, right? But there are those marks, there are those scars, and how can we recreate, you know, the mechanisms of torture if we give the torture victim the benefit of the doubt, if we if we say, you know, there's a lot that we don't know, but there's a lot that we do know based on really looking at these scars. And so uh, uh, it was both a torture device, a way of describing a really horrific torture device, but it's also a way of describing knowledge, you know, knowledge that gets erased and what we can say even about that knowledge that gets erased based on the pain that people experienced and really taking seriously the pain that people experienced. And, you know, the last thing I'll say to put those kind of two central metaphors together for me is that um, maybe perhaps the original, uh, one of the original torture devices for uh, Black people in the U.S. Um, when they eventually attained their freedom was uh, uh, the branches on which they were lynched, right? So if we think about the tree that the lynched man or woman is hanging from, that for me is a way of thinking about both the torture tree and the black box as, you know, these torture device that really conceal a larger structure of state violence that as citizens we all have the potential to be complicit in, and we might not know the story of how that person was lynched or how they got on that tree, but we owe it, you know, the future of our democracy depends on us trying to recreate the scene of the crime and try to really think through what those scars and what that injury means, and really trying to think about, okay, um, how can we dismantle these kind of systems that produce violence in this way?
And like I said, part of the power of your book is the stories you tell about different people. Two that kind of caught me is it's in the section about the B team. You talk about two policeman and policewoman, William Parker and Doris Bird. I was wondering if you could tell a little bit of their stories and the significance of it for you and your reading.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, William, both of them are Black police officers and who were uh, around during the same kind of era that Burge was around. Parker started a little bit earlier than Bird, but what struck me about this was that I really struggled in the book about how to write about torture, and I didn't want to kind of glorify torturers and 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 get into their psychology, because again, I think there's a way in which we let ourselves off the hook as citizens when we think about when we scapegoat torturers and say, "Oh, these people are just evil and they just did these horrific things." But I wanted to think about what did other people know at the time. And so the Black officers were interesting to me because I noticed very early on that none of them were um, in um, what Burge called his A team, which were the officers that he trusted. In fact, Burge was known to be racist, so he didn't really have a lot of Black officers in these privileged positions. And so I wanted to know what their story was, partially because they later came out and both Doris Bird and Parker later came out and testified on behalf of torture victims in civil cases. And their stories intrigued me. On the one hand, Parker, he was the kind of upright police officer that any time he noticed something wrong, he spoke out. And his career suffered for that. And he was continuously marginalized and continuously demoted until he was uh, just almost uh, a just a marginalized member of the police force during his time there. The black officers who came after him, like Doris Bird, learned from his example, and they learned from the other example of the examples of other officers who really spoke up once they saw something wrong. And they witnessed how these officers were marginalized continuously and demoted continuously. So they tried to take another uh, approach. And that approach was to um, strategically and intentionally avoid any kind of knowledge of torture. And so people would tell them that Burge was doing those things. They would hear, screams coming from interrogation rooms, but they did their best to, avoid any knowledge. And in that way, they tried to avoid being complicit. But of course, their silence is what made them complicit. And so when I was talking to community members about these officers and what they did and didn't do, a lot of them reacted really harshly to these figures, the black officers. There was a sense that um, there are bonds based on race, and these officers should have spoken up when they knew that black suspects were being tortured because they were black. And so, they were in a double bind situation. But I think that I think it's important to see how even, even not knowing can be a form of complicity if you're not consciously working to do what it's right, and in this case, just to uphold your sworn duty. And I know that those officers who stayed silent, a lot of them do have regrets, and a lot of them have dedicated their lives to trying to rectify those regrets. And so I wanted to share those stories because, we don't know when we're going to find ourselves in a similar situation professionally. And it's important to know in real time what kind of morality we need to have and anchor ourselves in, so that we don't live a life, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, where we're living with regrets because there are things that we could have prevented if we had the courage enough to say what was right, say what was wrong during the moment in time when it mattered most.
Good.
Can you tell us about Eddie Johnson, and what do you think about the circumstances about his being fired by Mayor Lightfoot?
Yeah, so when I started writing this book, Eddie Johnson was really just taking over, and there was a lot of hope that he would kind of be a new kind of leader for the Chicago Police Department. And a lot of that hope stemmed from the fact that he was born and raised in some of the most disadvantaged communities in Chicago, the kind of communities that are heavily surveilled and policed heavily today. but of course, that didn't pan out, and he was eventually kind of fired for his own misconduct by the mayor Lightfoot. And I think that what it shows, and what I try to show throughout the book, is that you know it takes more than one officer, either good or bad. It takes more than one bad apple to destroy the trust and legitimacy of a police force. It takes more than one quote unquote good officer to fix the problem. It really has to do with the structures that are in place and the incentives that are in place for people to rise to the ranks and people to attain the positions that they do have. And so one thing I try to, or I hope that people get out of the book, is that these kind of incentive structures are so powerful that it makes perfect sense why people are acting and behaving the way they are within their situation, right? And in order for things to change, we have to think about the whole structure and think about change on that level. And again, it's easy to scapegoat Burge. It's easy to point to the failings of someone like Eddie Johnson and say, they couldn't get it done, and blame them for the reason that the police department is the way it is, and has the kind of lack of trust that it does. But the question that I want to point people to is, what is to stop this from happening again, both in Chicago or anywhere else, right? If we have the same kind of incentive structures for people to close the case, and the same pressures to get confessions, and the same, privilege of, those who are able to get arrested, and the same silencing of those who come forward, how are we going to prevent this from happening again? And so that's one of the major questions of the book.
I think at this point, we have one comment from one of our persons in the audience. Let me share that. You can react to it if you like. It's probably not in your peer review, however, the underlying reasons for how the torturer becomes a torturer is an underlying story. It points out how society fails children and young adults. In general, people don't wake up one day from a normal life and decide, oh, maybe today I'm going to see what it's like to torture someone. In terms of how our country turns a blind eye to both the origins and current state of the infinite kinds of torture and oppression is the root. This applies to our carceral system and the work that IAHR does to lift up the individual's innate divinity and right to rehabilitation and inclusion as a member of society. So I guess maybe this idea, I guess it's related to your previous comment about the structures, about how one becomes a torturer.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I could say a few words about that, just based on the life of John Burge and Richard Zuli, who I also talk about in the book. And these men are kind of, known torturers now. And I think what's interesting about these cases is in both cases, these Chicago police officers have connections to the military and have served in wars. And I think that in Burge's case, he had served in Vietnam, and he had come back to Chicago and became a police officer after having served in Vietnam in his early 20s. And it hasn't definitively been proven, but many people think that the black box came from his experience in Vietnam and the way they used to repurpose military telephones for the purpose of torture. And it's, for a while, scholars of policing used to say that the distinction between the police and the military was that when you're in a state of war, anything can happen. There are no rules. Uh, there's an enemy threat, and you have to deal with the enemy. No, any way that you can. But when it comes to domestic policing, there are rules, and violence should be used as a last resort. You should kind of expend all of your attempts to quell the situation before you expend violence. And we know now that that kind of distinction is erroneous, and maybe it never really existed. But I think it speaks to the fact that the way that torturers are cultivated is by seeing people as less than human, and 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 as a society we've granted that to people in the way that we imagine, war, the way we imagine terrorists and terrorism, the way that we imagine these dangers. And and this kind of shows that we can't just turn that switch off in people once we activate it, once we say that, okay, as an 18-year-old, when you're fighting at war, the Viet Cong are not human, they're enemies, and expect them to come back as a 20-year-old at 21 or 22 and join a police force and not believe that the people who they take into custody are somehow human now. They treat them the same way, and so we are actually kind of fostering that dehumanization when we think about these threats, and when we think about danger, and when we don't afford humanity to all people. And I think that's a danger, and it bears out when we think about the biographies of the torturers in this particular book.
I have a question. Your book is organized as a series of letters addressed to future mayors of Chicago, to Eddie Johnson. Yeah. How did you come to organize your book that way? It's a unique format. And I'm just curious as to what made you decide to go that route.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Really, the idea came from struggling with like how to write about torture, and I think when you write about torture, there's a way in which you have to be aware of the fact that torture can be entertainment for people, and it could be entertainment for people in the same way that we watch like shows like Cops, or Law and Order, or any of these kind of things where people are being tortured. And so and there's a way in which when we just in popular culture now, there's the viral video of the person getting shot by the police, and that can have a life of its own. And so when you're writing about torture, you kind of don't know where to begin and where to stop, like how many examples to use and or not to use, and like what does the reader need to know, what don't they need to know. And so it's like, on the one hand, you don't want to make it voyeuristic, but on the other hand, certain aspects like what the black box is and how it works, and the marks that are left on the body are crucially important, because you don't want to sanitize that, because that is how we know that torture existed, right? And so when I was thinking about how to write this, I noticed that when I was with torture survivors and they talked to people about what happened, it never seemed voyeuristic, and it never crossed that line of being inappropriate. And I thought for a long time about why that was. And I realized that each time they were talking to particular people and they had a purpose, and they were telling people exactly what they needed to know because for a particular reason. And that's the birth of the idea of the letter for me. Survivors felt that they wanted to address, and I was telling them what happened, and there was a purpose for me telling the particular story. It was a way for me to stay focused. It was a way for me to not say too little or not say too much, and then it was a way to explain torture to a general public that that they could understand the importance of why this particular story was urgent at this particular moment in time. Guided, it was an anchor for me in writing this book. And the other thing is that, you know, when you write a book as an academic, there's always, you know, one of your audience is always other academics that are writing about the same thing. And I was really against just writing another book that was about for academics who also study torture. You know, like that's not the point of this. It was, you know, really for the public, and really to understand how this history of torture can impact them today in very concrete ways. And so the letter allowed me to make that clear.
Nice. That's really nicely said. Here's another question from someone in our audience. Could you comment on the use of the word torture rather than saying harsh techniques or even cruelty to describe this behavior?
Yeah, thanks for that question. In the word torture, it really comes out of activism, and it comes out of really purposeful and intentional efforts to not kind of look at the U.S. as a silo, but really look at what's happening all over the world. And so there was actually a lot of activism in order for us to see these cases as torture cases in particular. And it coincides with how we're talking about torture abroad always. And so the first, you know, it really happened in three phases. The first phase was in the 90s, where people were talking about torture in Latin America and dictatorships, and activists in Chicago were working with groups like Amnesty International to say that no, these men were actually tortured. If you look at international law and you look at how we're defining torture in these other contexts, then there was a movement after 9/11 where torture again becomes something in the national consciousness, and activists are saying again, if we look at an international standard. And the most recent episode was during around 2010, when we're thinking about Guantanamo Bay and what's happening there. And people are comparing what's happening in Guantanamo Bay to Chicago. And so I use torture because these are, they're really connected to how we're thinking about torture internationally. And sometimes there are direct connections between Chicago police officers who have tortured in other contexts, and they're torturing and doing the exact same thing in Chicago. And the United Nations and try to bring awareness to this. And so the key point is this is not happening within a vacuum in the U.S. It's happening all across the world, and people are using these same tactics. And our own government has no problem saying that this is torture when it happens in another country, but when it happens in the U.S., they don't want to see it as torture. And so it's important for us to have a common set of standards for how we think about torture. And also for activists, it's a way to shame the U.S. and say, like, if you really believe in the ideals of democracy that you espouse, then you will kind of recognize that state actors are doing these things on American soil. And so I think it's important to make that point as well.
So it's kind of a follow-up to that, when you talk about, we uphold our democracy and kind of our ideals, there are, with everything that's going on with Black Lives Matter and policing reform, I think virtually every state is kind of introducing some sort of policing reform bill packages. For instance, I know in Maryland, we're looking at making officers' disciplinary records available to the public. And so not shielding and not redacting. Do you think if any of these reforms legislatively are passed, do you think that that will make a difference? And if so, how? If no, why? And what do you really see as a way that the community can sort of learn to, the Black and Brown community specifically, how can learn how to trust a system that has been, at the root of some of the very systemic things that we're all working to try to change? That was a loaded question, I know, and I apologize.
No problem. I think it's an important question. I think one of the tortures that I describe in the book, we only know that he tortured people in Chicago because of a book that a Guantanamo detainee wrote, and his name was redacted in the book, but there was one passage that the redactors missed. And so journalists followed up and looked at this person's career in Chicago, and they saw that people in Chicago had been complaining of, I think that's an instance where redactions are vitally important and people's records are vitally important. And they should have informed, who, the military and who this person was, and made a difference on how they were seen internationally when it comes to special missions, but it obviously didn't. But I think, when we think about this, the reform debate, we realize quickly, if we look at a historical perspective, that a lot of these reforms are kind of versions of what's happened in the past in different places, and they have not necessarily been successful. And I think the key issue is really thinking about what the police do, as a function in society. And a lot of times, most of the time, they're trained to react to problems that already exist. And so we're not asking them to do, preventative measures or to get at the roots of problems in society. They're not equipped to do that. What they're equipped to do is to react to problems, and the way that they react is with force. And so that is the root of the problem. I think in order for a radical structural change, what we do need are institutions that are addressing the root of these problems that produce crime. And we know what the problems are. We know that they're related to poverty. We know that they're related to health care and mental illness and addiction. And so, but we've invested so much on policing, and we've extracted so much from the institutions that deal with those uh, root causes, that all we're left with is a robust police state. And so I think any long-term solution, needs to think outside of policing itself and think about holistically, how do we invest in society to make it, to really look out for everyone's well-being.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, you have, I still remember this paragraph you quote in the beginning of your book, where you say every dollar that goes to fund the police in Chicago, only about 2 cents goes to mental health and another 2 cents for other social services. And so it's quite dramatic to see the disparity between what's invested in the community, human resources, as opposed to police and responding by force. So you see those statistics, it's quite dramatic.
It's quite dramatic, and we wonder why, like, it is that way. And I think in terms of complicity, just to come, back around to this, I think it's been a major theme of this discussion, but it's really important to understand the nature of complicity and ask questions like, why do we allow that to happen? And we have to recognize like how powerful the idea of the criminal is in all of our minds, and how much we are guided by that sense that we will be victimized by criminals, and what that does to a society, right? And I mean, it's no accident that at this stage in the presidential campaign, Trump is really returning hard to this idea of law and order. And he's returning to it, even calling Joe Biden a criminal now, because he knows it's powerful and he knows it works, right? And so we have to really question, why is it so powerful? Why does it work? And how is that motivating what we invest in as a country?
Yeah. Kim, do you have we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I would really like to know is, as a result of your book, have mayors, have governors, has anybody kind of, stood up and addressed this? And certainly, people that were in your book, I mean, are you seeing this shift in what we're willing to accept? I think that one of the things that concerns me is like the unions. We here in, I'm sure every state comes up against officers' unions, and the amount of power that they have, the amount of sway that they hold with politicians. I mean, we're just now trying to beat back an officer's Bill of Rights here in Maryland. Are you seeing that same kind of shift? Do you think that as a result of your book, people are more willing to put out what torture really is and the history of it?
Yeah, I mean, there is some reason for hope. I think when my book first came out, I think the country's actually in a very different place now from when it first came out in January. And I think that had a lot to do with the summer and, the events of the summer with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. And I think that has put in a kind of even the terms of the debate have shifted a little bit, and I think um, just even the fact that kind of defund the police is now like people know what that is. Like when I wrote the book, people didn't know what that was. When I was talking about movements to defund the police that were taking place in Chicago, people had no idea about what that was or why people were saying that. And I think that we can have conversations now that weren't even possible several months ago. And so I think, and one of those conversations is about police unions and is about kind of the entrenched power of the police state. And so I think while there's no easy solutions, and while there are some entrenched problems, I do think that there is more willingness to address them, and there's more visibility to how a lot of these things are structured, which I just hope that it continues, that we're able to keep engaging in these conversations. And um, I've been kind of speaking on these issues for a long time, and right now is I think a really crucial moment for um, the willingness of people to listen, and the willingness of people to think through like what real change will look like. Um, so the outcome is not certain, but I do think it matters that we're able to have conversations now that we couldn't have a couple months ago.
One last question. How was the book received in Chicago? Was it reviewed it in Chicago, and was there comment about it? You know about
Yeah.
it. Just since this, its focus is on torture in Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, I've been encouraged by the reception of the book so far. Um, I think there's been a lot of uh, conversations that are possible because of the book. And I also just, recently released a short film called The Torture Letters. It's an animated film. But it is, as part of the book, it, what I like to say is the book is part of a movement, I think, in Chicago. And a lot of people are thinking through this issue of torture historically and how it impacts them today. And this includes torture survivors and lawyers. And I think my book is part of that. And as part of that, um, we're kind of dedicated to uh, addressing a younger generation and thinking through um, equipping them with the knowledge that this could potentially happen to you, and this is what's happened in the past, and these are kind of things we wish we would have known when we were your age. And so the book, the animated film, um, they're all towards that purpose, and having the kind of conversations that I wrote the book to have, and including this one. And I think I've been really excited and really heartened by the response so far.
Is the film open to the public? Could we get a link to it?
Yeah, I'll
Post it
send.
on our website and things like
Yeah,
that?
definitely. I'll send you a link. It's
Great.
I did it in collaboration with the New York Times. They distributed it.
Uh-huh.
It's called The Torture Letters as well. But I'll definitely send you a link after we get offline.
Well, we'd be happy to post it and promote it on social media and things like that. Well, thank you so much, Professor Ralph. This has been a very engaging interview. We had some really nice comments in our chat box about it. People thanking you for the interview, and even a fellow anthropologist was online and listened to it. And was
Great.
very impressed, so, which is great. I want to thank Kim Haven for joining me and helping interview. Really wonderful. And thank our audience for attending. And I want to wish everyone, it's a beautiful day here in this part of the world, in the District of Columbia area. I hope it is by you and everyone else. So please enjoy the rest of the day, and we will post this interview as well on our website.